What's up everyone? Thanks so much for tuning in. For today's video, I start the very extensive process of rebuilding the front suspension in my 240SX. This thing needed so much work. You had all of these original parts that are approaching 30 years old, like bushings and ball joints. They were just destroyed, and the aftermarket control arms that I had put in the car like early last year were also failing, which is just crazy. I'm going to talk about all of that stuff and more, but by the time this is all said and done, which as you can see right now it is done, it's going to be a pretty sweet setup using a combination of both high quality aftermarket and original Nissan parts. Because there was so much stuff that had to be done here, I decided to split the front suspension rebuild into two parts. So this part is going to focus primarily on disassembly, talking about everything that was wrong, the plans going forward, and getting everything cleaned and prepped for reassembly. But before I go any further, I wanted to thank you guys for your continued patience over what seems like an eternity since the last 240 video, because my wife and I have actually been in the process of moving for a while now, and while we're almost done, there's still a lot of stuff that needs to be done, including working on my new garage, which if you guys follow me on Instagram and some of the other social media channels, I've been posting a lot about that lately, which is going to be the future home of Project Car Central. So once I get this back on the ground and the suspension in order, we can start tackling the new engine, like swapping all that stuff out and starting some other projects that I have in the works. So a lot of really exciting stuff to come. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any questions regarding the 240 in general or regarding any of the parts that I used in this video, I have some links in the description below. Otherwise, post them in the comments and I'll try my best to answer everybody. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Before I can get access to anything, I need to first drop the factory Undertray. It's held in by a bunch of screws and clips. Now this thing is made from plastic and it's designed to protect the underside of the engine from dirt, debris, and water, but unfortunately this one was in really bad shape. Aside from being covered in oil, a lot of the mounting tabs are broken and there's some actual rips in the plastic, so it's not something we want to put back in the car. So to finish everything off, I'm going to be installing a replacement aluminum pan from Phase 2 motor trim, which is not only significantly bigger than the factory one, it's supposed to benefit cooling, but I'll talk about that more in the next video. With the under tray out of the way, I can move on to dropping the sway bar. This is super straightforward. You have to remove both of the retaining brackets that hold in the sway bar bushings and undo the bottoms of both of the end links. After that, it's just a matter of wiggling it free. Instead of getting an aftermarket sway bar with aftermarket end links, I decided to just take all that I had and upgrade it from there. Upon closer inspection, the end links were trashed. The little rubber bushings were squished, hard, and cracked. The ball joints were so bad that they were actually splitting open and allowing all of the grease to come out. The sway bar bushings themselves were actually decent looking. I didn't notice any cracks or anything like that, but they're still going to all get replaced. So here's the plan. I'm going to get the sway bar powder coater to get rid of any corrosion and make it look brand new. But for the end links, I'm going to rebuild them from scratch using Nissan genuine parts. The same methodology is going to be applied to the rear sway bar as well, but in a separate video. Instead of going for OE style rubber bushings, I'm actually going to be swapping poly bushings in for the sway bars and the end links, which should give the car a tighter feel and be a lot more durable long term. Alright, let's get back to the suspension. When I was removing the aftermarket tension rods that were put on the car earlier last year, I noticed something that was not just surprising but quite disappointing considering they hadn't been on the car that long. When I got them off and started looking at them close, it appeared that the rubber bushings were already starting to dry rot. The front arms were both cracked pretty severely. And this is coming off of a car that's never seen a track. But the bigger problem is that the entire rear suspension was having the same problem. Even worse in some instances where the rubber bushings were actually tearing. So yeah, this was unfortunate for sure, but you know, everything happens for a reason. I'm glad I did this series and found this problem and pulled them all out of the car, because with everything that I'm going to be doing to the car over time, especially with the engine swap and adding power, it's not worth having a potential safety risk. In my research, I came across SPL parts. In my opinion, they make some of the highest quality aftermarket suspension components that you can buy, and for quite a range of vehicles too. So for the 240, I'm going to be installing their Titanium Series control arms front and rear, along with an eccentric lockout kit and some other goodies. I look forward to sharing all of that with you in more detail in the second part of the front suspension rebuild and during the rest of the rear end rebuild series. Because I need to tear down the whole suspension to do this properly, I need to now remove the brakes. I did a big brake conversion last October with the help of my friend Charles. You guys probably know him as the Humble Mechanic. I've really enjoyed this setup. I paired it to a 300ZX master cylinder and brake booster, so the pedal feel is great, and it feels like it could have come from the factory, just with a whole lot more bite. Plus, it made for a pretty sweet video. If you haven't seen it already, the link is in the top right hand corner of this video and in the description box below. One of the hardest things about doing this car so far has been figuring out the right way to go about things, because sometimes I take 2 steps backward to go 1 step forward. In a perfect world, it'd be nice just to take it all apart one time and rebuild it from there, so I'm not having to take things apart, put it back together, take things apart, put it back together, and just creating more work for myself. But at the end of the day, this is a learning process, and I'm figuring out how my car goes together and getting more confident about doing this work over time. It wouldn't surprise me at all if these ball joints were original to the car. Look how bad they were. Dry rotted, splitting, cracking, leaking grease everywhere. The ones in the tie rods were actually split in 2 separate halves. I don't even think there was any grease in them. So aside from getting all of that replaced, I'm also going to replace the inner and outer tie rods using a combination of SPL and original Nissan parts, because the original equipment was full of play and we don't want that. To remove the tie rods from the car, you have to first free up the end from the spindle. To do that, you have to pull out the cotter pin and unscrew the castle nut on top. This next part you can do by hand, but it makes it a lot easier to just rent one of these special tools from your local auto parts store. It breaks the tension between the ball joint and the spindle. I filmed it this way so you guys can see how it all worked, but my recommendation is to hold on to that tool because there is a lot of tension. You don't want to take a risk of it popping loose like this, otherwise you could damage some part of your car or yourself. Also, if you're reusing your tie rods, it's a good idea to prop them up so they don't just fall to the ground, but obviously in my case it didn't matter. When removing the tie rod end, I counted the number of turns that it took to remove it completely, so when I'm putting the new assembly back together, I can get it kinda close to where it was before, and then get the car properly aligned after that. Next, it was a matter of removing the original dust boots, so I could get access to the inner portion of the tie rods. These, as you would expect, are designed to prevent junk from getting into sensitive areas of your steering, but these were ripped on both sides and no longer doing their job, so the only thing left to do is replace them. You can unscrew the inner tie rod using an appropriate sized wrench, or again, you can rent a specialty tool from a local auto parts store, so I just went ahead and did that. The inner tie rod fits within that big cylinder, and there's some adapter plates that clamp around the end that actually needs turning. So you can use a breaker bar to pop it loose, and then a regular socket wrench to take it out the rest of the way. Something else to be aware of on the 240, there's a little 4-sided metal clamp on the back of the inner tie rod. To get an appropriate tool in there, you need to try to carefully bend the tabs back unless you're going to be replacing it. They're still available from Nissan, so I would recommend replacing it instead of trying to reuse an old bent part. I tried to use the little ball joint tool on the one for the control arm as well, but there wasn't enough clearance, so I opted just to remove the whole spindle control arm assembly and just smack it out with a hammer. This is something else that I would not necessarily recommend doing just for obvious reasons, but I'm not reusing these lower control arms. I have new ones from Nissan, so it doesn't matter if the original ones get damaged. If you ever have a stubborn bolt, penetrating fluid will help out a whole lot. It's also a really good idea to replace all of these old nuts and bolts with new ones, but I'll talk about that more in the next video. The last 2 things I needed to remove were the tension rod brackets. Now the tension rods connect on one side to the lower control arm, the other side to these. I'm going to be replacing these with a Nismo power brace, which is very similar in design, but it actually has a welded in rod in the middle to bridge the 2 sides and stiffen things up. As you can see, these bolts were in for quite a long time, and they were almost impossible to remove without the help of the impact gun. Well everyone, that's the end of part 1. I wasn't kidding when I said there was a lot of stuff that had to be done on this car, but you know, all of this effort is going to be well worth it in the end, especially when I can finally get this car back on the ground and see how she really feels with the limited slip differential and all the upgraded suspension components. I imagine it's going to be awesome. Once again, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to leave a like below, and if you haven't subscribed already, be sure to, because there's always a lot more where that came from. Take care, everyone.